Good evening. Welcome to Noble's Community Conversation. My name is Art Franklin. We apologize for the delay. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, but we're ready to begin now. And I'm glad to be back for what is now my fourth year in a row as moderator for the Alabama chapter, Noble's annual event. You may remember in previous years, we were in large banquet halls with keynote speakers and good food and great music and scholarship presentations, just lots of people all dressed up, looking good, having a good time, and completing the mission of serving and representing those who serve and protect and uphold the law, not abuse it, but uphold it with integrity and fairness. Things, as you know, are a lot different this year. Coronavirus pandemic prompted Noble to put safeguards in place to protect the health of those involved. So here we are now in this virtual environment, but that won't stop those involved from representing Noble as they have in the past. We're here tonight, also during a time when there is a lot of unrest and scrutiny of those in law enforcement community. It makes this community conversation all the more important. And we're not going to skirt the issues. We're going to have a real conversation. The only way we can have real change and real impact is to have a real conversation. Just a few, you're going to meet our distinguished panel, but let me first get an official welcome from Noble. Please welcome the president of the Alabama chapter of Noble, retired deputy chief from the Birmingham Police Department, Mr. Henry Irby.
I'm not Henry.
We can't get to Henry at this point. This is the president of the national president of Noble, and let me introduce her. She represents nearly 60 chapters and more than 3,800 members worldwide. Allow me to introduce retired deputy director of the U.S. Service, Miss Linda R. Williams. Take it away, Linda.
Good evening. On behalf of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Noble, our executive board, constituents, and members, I bring you greetings. I am Linda Williams, National President. At a time such as this, it's important that we have these crucial, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about the future of law enforcement. Issues such as police reform, gun violence, and social and racial injustices continue to plague our Black and Brown communities. So, to Henry Irby and the entire Alabama chapter of Noble, Art Franklin, our moderator, and our panel of distinguished guests, and to you, our virtual audience, I thank you. So let's have a good conversation. And oh, last but not least, be the change, get out to vote. Thank you, and God bless you.
Linda, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate you bringing greetings from the national office, and we will be hearing from the Alabama chapter of Noble, Henry Irby, a little bit later on. Linda, thank you. I want to thank you guys for joining us as well. As you can see from Noble's national president, Noble has some very accomplished members who represent chief executive officers and command level law enforcement officials from federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies as well, and criminal justice practitioners. And you're about to meet them as I introduce our panelists. Beginning with Jefferson County District Attorney, Alabama's 10th Judicial District Circuit, Birmingham Division, the Honorable Danny Carr. And we'll be hearing from Danny Carr shortly. We're going to be hearing from Danny Carr in just a few. I just wanted to introduce all the panelists at this time, and they're going to be joining us, and then they'll get a chance to do some opening statements in just a few. Also, Jefferson County District Attorney, Alabama's 10th Judicial Circuit, Bessemer Cutoff, the Honorable Lynneice Washington, is a panelist with us as well. All right. We apologize. We're still getting used to the platform as we are introducing our panelists. And just want to remind our engineer, we are introducing each one of our panelists. We're going to bring them in and we're going to keep them in. And then after we get all of our panelists in, then we will have an opportunity for our panelists to have opening statements. So you've seen District Attorney Danny Carr, also Lynneice Williams. Let me let me now bring in another panelist who started back in 1991 as an officer with the Birmingham Police Department, worked in Fairfield before joining the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, then elected as sheriff. Our next panelist is Sheriff Mark Pettway. All right, thanks a lot. So we have Mark Pettway there. And then after a decorated career in Los Angeles in the police department there, he came home to Alabama to be the top cop in the city of Birmingham. Also one of the sharpest dressers around, Chief Patrick Smith, the Birmingham Police Department, is our next panelist. Our next panelist started as an officer in 1986, went on to a distinguished career at various levels of the Atlanta Police Department. He's now serving as the top cop in the Montgomery Police Department. Chief Earnest Finley is with us now. I'm going to ask the panelists to go ahead and mute themselves until we get ready for the discussion. We will be bringing in Chief Earnest Finley as well. Right now, let's bring in our next panelists. Pastors of one of the top mega churches in Alabama, the Worship Center with campuses in Bessemer, Birmingham, and Anniston, the author of several books, just completed a teaching series on racism, truth, and reconciliation. Bishop Vann Moody is with us as well. Bishop Moody is there. One more panelist to introduce tonight. She represents community organizers, Faith in Action, and Alabama Peacemakers. She'll keep it real. Miss Onoyemi Williams is with us as well. There we go. All right. So now you see our group of panelists there, and we're ready to begin the discussion. You've met them, so now we want to hear from them, and we want to begin in order of our introduction. So we're going to begin our discussion, our introduction, with our opening statements from District Attorney Danny Carr. Danny, you have the floor.
Let me first say good evening to everyone, and let me first obviously set protocol. Ms. Linda Williams, Noble National President, obviously Art Franklin, thank you again for being the moderator and being a part of our community in various forms, and each and every person that's on this panel. I'm fortunate enough to know everybody on this panel, and I'm grateful for each and every person on this panel for what you do each and every day throughout our community. So I just wanted to be brief and say that I'm looking forward to the conversation. And as usual, I'm looking forward to also learning and gathering information from the panelists, just like hopefully the audience and the people that's listening today. So I'm grateful to be here and looking forward to it. So thank you.
All right, Danny, thank you very much. Let's now go to District Attorney Lynneice Washington. Lynneice.
Good evening to everyone, to our distinguished panel and to our virtual audience. It's always good to see you, Art, and thank you again for moderating for Noble, as you always do so well. Just want to thank everyone who's listening in this evening. There will be some very important issues that we're discussing. We have a lot of things that are going on in our community. We have voting issues. We have social injustices. And this is going to be a robust conversation. And we would like for those who are listening, if you can, to ask questions. And I'm just delighted to be a part of this distinguished panel, and I look forward to our discussions this evening.
All right. Thank you very much, Lynneice. So glad to have you with us always. Sheriff Mark Pettway, you have the floor now, sir.
Good evening. I'd like to greet everyone that is here this afternoon. Thank you, Noble and President Ms. Linda Williams and Art Franklin. We thank you for moderating. We're just excited to be a part of this panel here with these distinguished guests that are here. We're excited about the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. We expect to see change from this conversation. We know there's going to be some things that will be said this afternoon that can be taken away from here to make good change within our community. So yes, I'm glad to be a part of this, and thank you for allowing me to sit on this panel.
Thank you, Sheriff Chief Patrick Smith. Now you have your opening statement, sir. Is Chief still with us? Until we get Chief back on, let's bring in Bishop Moody. Bishop Moody, your opening statements.
Well, my statements really kind of echo the sentiments of my esteemed panelists, to the National Noble Organization, the local chapter, to all of my friends, brothers, and sisters that are part of this panel, and those of you that are watching virtually. It's a joy to be a part of conversations that help to bring change. And so I'm honored to be a part of this conversation and looking forward to the things that are helpful that are coming out of this conversation so that we can work together for a brighter future.
Mr. Moody, thank you. We now have Chief Patrick Smith. Chief Smith, just some opening words.
Hopefully this works, Art. But I want to first say thank you for having me on. Thank you for...
We may be having some internet issues where Chief is. I think we just lost him. We're going to go with Oni now. Ms. Williams, your opening statements.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank the law enforcement community for inviting the activist world into your sphere and realm of which you work. It's oftentimes that we only want to hear one side of the story and not listen to the other side. And so this conversation is so welcome, and it's such an honor to have the opportunity to hear and share with some champions the law enforcement bill, and to both have an opportunity to grow on both ends. And so thank you for this opportunity just to share what the sentiments are of the community from the perspective of the activists.
We certainly appreciate that, Ms. Williams, and glad to have you a part of the conversation. That is a part of the conversation that is very much needed. And so we're going to move into the area of discussion now. If you don't know already, I want to inform you that you can be part of this conversation if you post your question in the comment section on Facebook. Chances are, especially, we've lost some time, so we won't get to every question, but I'll try to get to as many as possible, depending on how the discussion goes from this point on. But we do welcome your questions and request that you remain respectful when posting your question or comment. We're going to begin with the area of social justice. Talking about that, we have seen the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen protests throughout, not only throughout this country, but in fact throughout the world. There's a lot of unrest out there right now. So Ms. Williams, let's begin with you. Why don't you weigh in with how you see social justice and how it relates to law enforcement?
How do I see social justice as it relates to law enforcement? Well, that's a loaded question. So when you talk about social justice in law enforcement, they're actually two different things. There are systems that are in place that feed into one another, that create the injustice that we often talk about. Law enforcement are just one part of it. It's just one link in the chain that has to be dealt with, addressed, and discussed. For people who are living in the community, when it comes to law enforcement, we have to remember that the community has a memory. They have a memory of how the police were initially introduced into the community. They have the memory of generations that were previously inhabitants of this country, and what that meant to encounter state capture. And that was a form of law enforcement, and how that morphed In Alabama, we remember Bull Connor and the segregation and how law enforcement was used to control the people of the community and the injuries that were caused by that institution. And so when we move ahead to the time and space that we're in now, and we're discussing social justice and law enforcement, it's important for us to talk about the memories of yesteryears and what we know to be the truths of today. What has been the actual documented occurrences of injury by the law enforcement system itself, not just officers, but I'm talking about from arrest to incarceration to reentry into the community, and that whole streamline, what is taking place to a community and how that injustice or how that and how it has been lopsided and allowed to work to penalize certain communities more than others. So
what I'd like to do here, and we're going to get law enforcement to weigh in a second. I want to kind of set the tone for where we're going. So Bishop Moody, I mentioned that you recently wrapped up a teaching series on racism and injustice. What is it that we need to confront as a nation when we talk about those issues?
Well, there's a lot that we need to confront, and a lot of what Mrs. Williams talked about in terms of the memory of our community is where we start. We have to confront the fact that the past, particularly when you don't deal with it, is a great predictor of issues in the present and in the future. And what our country in particular has never dealt with is its complicity and its benefit from the institution of slavery and oppression in general. One of the things that I think separates our country from other countries that may not be considered stellar in the minds of Americans, but I think that there are other countries like Canada and South Africa and places like Rwanda that are much further down the road as it relates to issues of race and injustice, largely because they've been willing to have a conversation about it. We have a tendency in America to, number one, want to ignore the problem, act like it didn't happen, or even to have amnesia or to have selective memory as it relates to the past. And it only takes, people really intently taking their rose-colored glasses off and seeing that things that are happening today are happening because we haven't adequately dealt with the things of the past. And so when we talk about, and a lot of times what people want is they want to fix it immediately. How do we fix law enforcement? How do we fix what's happening in our communities? Well, you can't fix it with knee-jerk reactions. You've got to, number one, understand, how did we get here? Because within that history are really the clues that we need to make good decisions forward. And I really believe that that's actually the part of the that's part of the role that activists should play. I've been confronted by a lot of people that don't see the need for activism. And, I think that activism, particularly protest, is a part of what makes our country special. But beyond that, we have to have conversations, and we can't wear our emotions on our sleeves. We can't be afraid to deal with the ugly part of our history. America has a tendency to want to highlight heroes, but not deal with its horrors. And we've got to deal with both. And those are the kind of conversations and confrontations that we have to have in order to move forward the right way. The African-American community has been raped, molested, abused, taken advantage of in a variety of ways because of the institution of slavery and oppression through race. And that's still happening today in a number of different ways. And we've got to talk about that in order to move forward the right way.
Bishop, thank you very much. I believe we have Chief Patrick Smith backstage. So, Wendell, if you could bring Chief Smith in. I just got a text from him. He is backstage. So if you would please bring the chief back into the conversation. And while we're doing that, I want to move up to Danny Carr, if I could, and talk about this whole issue that we're talking about now in terms of social justice. Everyone values the safety that police officers, that law enforcement provide to communities. this country is really at a place where people are no longer just ignoring the inequities and the racial disparities and injustice that we're seeing. So being there where you are, what does social justice mean to you, and being someone who has to prosecute things even when they go wrong in the law enforcement community?
Well, for me, social justice fall under a lot of categories, but the main category for me is that everyone is treated fairly and equally, but at the same time, making sure that how we approach this system of criminal justice, that we're not afraid to pivot and recognize that the way this system has worked in the past, obviously we all know, well, number one was not the best way for everybody, but number two, we have to recognize that and admit that on the front end. And what's important and why that's so important is because there's been a light shined on prosecutors. There's been a light shined on law enforcement that are patrol officers. But when you're talking about as a whole, you also have to look at, once they're in the system, then how they're treated. Then you also have to look at, once they're out of the system, as it relates to probation and parole, how they're treated. You have to look at all of the things that equate to the to the criminal justice system. Even when you look at fines and fees, even when you look at whether indigent people can get in certain programs that others can't. I mean, you have to look at all of those things and truly look at that and see if the system is treating everybody equally and fairly. Because at the end of the day, most people will admit when they've screwed up, but most of the time, we won't admit as a system that we're not doing all we need to do to make sure that that person who ends up in the system comes out on the back end better. And there are so many layers to that from a vantage point of a prosecutor, because not only do we see law enforcement on the street and deal with the patrol officers, deal with the detectives, but we also have to deal with the judges. We also have to deal with the probation and parole board. So we have to deal with all of this. So in all honesty, we have to take a full spectrum look at the system and make sure as a whole that we're addressing everything across the board. Not just one, but everything across the board.
Thank you, Danny. Sheriff Pettway, if you would address that, how do we address everything across the board from a law enforcement standpoint, especially when we're dealing with the social unrest out there right now? How do we deal with everything across the board?
To deal with things across the board, I think we have to start with a lot of the teaching and training that we do within our profession. And it has to be somewhat standardized all across the board to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that we're doing the same thing, going in the same direction, saying the same thing. I would like to see something like that done, particularly here. We have an opportunity to look at some of the things that's going on right now, dealing with the homeless or those that the individuals that may have mental health issues. Those individuals, once they're arrested, they deteriorate a whole lot faster once they're incarcerated and put in jail. They do not need to be put in jail. To me, that is somewhat of a social injustice, that we need to have another facility for those individuals to be housed or be taken to. Right now, we do not have anything other than the jail for those individuals to be housed in right now. So we need to have something starting at the state to where we can have training, how to handle people with issues that are homeless, the issues of mental health. Also deal with communities that have felt marginalized. How do we go into those communities and police those communities? We need to do it on a basis that's all the way across the board, that's standardized. And we need to understand those communities and what the people in those communities feel like before we go in those communities and try to police them. Right now, they tell us that they're over-policed, but I listen to a lot of the elderly people in those communities. They want the police there. The younger people do not want police in the communities. So we have a problem right now dealing with the same street where people want policing, and we have people also on the same street that do not want policing. So we have problems right there within a same community. And we had to come together and have a discussion like this with those people in the community. We had to start with training our deputies and our officers first, how to deal with those people, and then go into the communities and talk with them to find out how we can better
Sheriff,
serve.
thank you very much. And I see our police chiefs joining. We've got Chief Finley has joined us from Montgomery. And Chief Finley, if you've been listening to the conversation, we've been talking about just the issue of social justice, but I want to talk about something that Sheriff Pettway brought up. And one of the big concerns from people in the community is the whole use of force by some officers. What do you think about in terms of training? Is that an area that needs to be updated within police departments and standardized?
Absolutely. And I think that the sheriff is absolutely correct. That's something that we got to constantly train, constantly make sure that each and every one of the officers understand, the use of force policy, how is being used. And that's the issue that we see. And again, part of that training, part of implied biases, implicit bias, explicit bias, all of that needs to be brought up front when we're dealing with these officers and dealing with these different communities and the different interactions that we have. So training is something that is, you do or die in law enforcement to make sure that we stay on top of that, and also work with best practice with the IACP, with Noble, with all these organizations that have that research to support the best practices when we deal with training with our officers.
Chief Finley, thank you very much. And I know we don't often get a chance to have those activists and police and law enforcement in the same conversation. And I want to get Onoyemi to jump in a few. But before I do that, I want to get up to District Attorney Lynneice Washington. As a prosecutor, Lynneice, when law enforcement officers bring cases of lawlessness before you for prosecution, you do your job. How difficult is it to do your job when the offender is a law enforcement officer?
Well, we recently have had something similar. It's not hard to do your job, regardless as to who the person is. We already have laws in place. The laws that govern our land, our nation, our world, they are not designed for a specific class. It's supposed to be for everyone. So in terms of criminal laws, any criminal action that comes before the courts and the cutoff, and I'm sure as well as in Birmingham, we look at the letter of the law. We don't look at the person. We look at the charge. We look at the incident as to what took place. We look at the appropriate sentencing, and that's how cases are handled in the Bessemer cutoff and in Jefferson County. We're in an environment now that there are so many times when police officers have been charged or have been pointed out for doing things wrong, for possibly excessive use of force or causing a death of someone, that oftentimes, even if it gets to the court door, it comes in the front and it goes out the back and is never addressed. And for a long time, society has just accepted that as a norm. It's just been accepted. It's like, well, if a police officer does something wrong, nothing is going to happen. But right now, we have an opportunity. We have leadership in place all over the world that we have changed in our gender. We have changed in our race. Not a whole lot, but there are people in leadership positions that can make sure that people are held accountable to the letter of the law and not by the class of which their profession is, or not by the color of their skin, or not by their gender. That is not how we practice law. So in Jefferson County, I know in Birmingham as well as in Bessemer cutoff, police officers are treated in terms of prosecution just like anyone else, as they should.
Thank you, Lynneice. I want to get down to Ms. Williams now. As we talk about excessive force and police brutality, got a lot to deal with in that area. One case too many. Where's the divide? How big is that problem, Ms. Williams?
It's a huge problem, especially when you have to understand about history. Oftentimes, people do not want to talk about there's been a history for lawmen to be able to do whatever they need to do their job. And in that history and in that development of a record, here officers when they put on that suit and they put on that uniform has a history attached to it that say you do whatever you got to do because you're the law. So if I have to be a little extra, if I feel that you're a little bit out of control, however I'm feeling, then that's the only meter of measurement that matters. And that's not correct. Because your meter of measurement, because you're behind your uniform, doesn't always necessarily mean you're calibrated correctly. And so you will have officers who are being excessive in the situation when it's not necessary. They're not checking the different touch points of the situation to understand, yeah, she may be elevated and aggravated and loud, but all of these other things have taken place with this person. So that's why they're a little bit apprehensive. That's not the time for you to go in and start grabbing on them. That's not the time for you because they're going to have the reaction where they're going to pull back. I've seen instances in the community where a parent has reached out, the child had a mental health issue, and they were offered their medication. And the officer grabbed the young man. Well, he was cycling. And they used excessive force with him. And they charged him with battery on LEO because the young man slung around, the officer went down, they proceeded to put whatever use of force they thought was necessary to apprehend him in that situation. And when we looked at the totality of it was, you forgot why you were out there. A young man that had a mental health issue was cycling. How were you handling him? Why did you reach into him like that? If you have any background in dealing with psych patients, you don't do certain movements on them. You have to take it a little bit slower. You can't be in a rush. And so all of this is part of that conversation about excessive use of force. We see the George Floyd cases, but let's talk about the excessive use of force when you're dealing with a parent that has maybe ran a light or they've done something, and now you have them on the side of the road and you're giving them citations for everything you could possibly give them a citation for. That's excessive use of force.
Let me get Police Chief Patrick Smith to join in. Police Chief Smith, what do you say to communities who are concerned about excessive force and police brutality? And I know in Birmingham has been pretty fortunate not to have some of the situations that we've seen in some other parts of the country. I don't know what the saving grace is here, but we haven't seen that. But what do you say to communities who are concerned about it still, even here, concerned about excessive force and police brutality?
Well, I think that in many cases, it's something that we have to constantly monitor and constantly have to keep our finger on the pulse of. We also have to let our departments know what is expected of them, what is needed from them. But oftentimes we go back to a great deal of history, but many of the young officers who are on the street, they're not familiar with it. And so we have to train them, we have to teach them, and we have to make them more aware of the community by working with them in the community and showing them the way that we would have them go. Excessive force in the manner in which she mentioned is something that every police agency has to be aware of and have to work incredibly hard to try to reduce and to de-escalate and make sure that we have people who are making wise decisions out in the streets.
Talking about wise decisions, Bishop Moody, I have to think about accountability at this point, and accountability is on both sides of the fence, from people in the community and from police. When things go wrong, is there accountability for some of the things that we see out there? Are police accountable for their actions? Are you seeing that? And then also in the community, when we see some of the lawlessness that happens there.
Well, I think the thing about accountability is people have got to want it and they've got to submit to it. And so I think that the better way for me to answer the question is I think that there could be significant improvements of accountability on both sides. You know, and I think one of the things, Art, that cannot be forgotten is that while there are problems on both sides, there are problems on the side of history in terms of injustice. There's many challenges that are real and that we're still trying to get our arms around. But I think that if we approach this with decency and respect, then I think that that can help us to kind of wade through it. I just think that there is too much suspicion. And I know that there are people that would argue, well, we have reason enough to be suspicious. But I think the problem is that a lack of relationship and a lack of dignity breeds greater suspicion and contempt. And I think that when you put those things together, it just creates a kind of catastrophic environment where people are misunderstood and mishandled, where assumptions are made, and things just kind of snowball out of control. So I think from an accountability standpoint on both sides, if we could submit to decency and respect and bring those things back and treat every person in every case with dignity and honor and respect, because every situation is nuanced. Just like Mrs. Williams talked about that child that maybe, was off his meds. Well, we don't know what that police officer, has been going through before that stop. I mean, there's so many variables that we have to figure out. And I don't know that all of us on any given moment have the wherewithal to understand every small detail that's involved in it. But I think we can address it if we can at least settle on the fact that every person deserves dignity, honor, and respect. And that the sum total of a person is not defined by the mistakes that they make. We're talking about fundamentally, how should we treat human beings on either side of the spectrum, whether they commit a crime or whether they're on the side of, helping to enforce, law and justice. If we could approach it with that vantage point, then I think we can do a better job on both sides with accountability.
Yeah, I saw District Attorney Lynneice Washington nodding her head in agreement there. You want to weigh in on that, Lynneice?
Yes, I totally agree with Bishop Moody. We have to, and accountability, until we accept the things that we do and address it, we won't be able to move forward. We talk about what I was definitely agreeing with, and what he caught my attention was talking about the police officers and how when they have encounters with the public, we don't know what call they've had prior to. And that was kind of leading to the mental wellness and mental well-being of police officers. We have a lot of police officers that from day to day, from minute to minute, call to call, every call they get is not someone inviting them over to their house for tea, but they are called to traumatic situations. And they're, from a child being killed to someone being shot, their problems. And we don't know what type of mental state that officer is in. So when you go to one call and you address that trauma, you go to another call, you address trauma. And I'm saying these things because I am married to a law enforcement officer. And we often talk about the different calls that he has to go to and how that makes him feel at the end of the day. And my husband also has PTSD. So those are officers, a lot of officers out there. Not only did they just start doing their work as law enforcement officer as an adult, but they have been in the military. A lot of them have come from the military and they've gone straight to law enforcement. And we need to, and I know there's a lot of accountability. There are a lot of questions about use of force, as there should be. But then we have to take a closer look to the mental well-being of the police officers that protect and serve our communities. So when Bishop Moody was talking about, we don't know what the officers have experienced before this the instant call. That's what I was agreeing with him on, in terms of the police officers and the things that they have to face and their mental well-being. And the thing, though, that is an issue. That is an issue that is important for the well-being and the healthiness of our community as well.
Indeed. And we've heard a lot of talk about defunding police or police reform. Want to turn to Chief Finley in Montgomery to get his thoughts on parts of the police department budget being used on community outreach programs and things of that nature. What are your thoughts on what we've heard about police reform and defunding police?
Well, we have been, my budget has been slack. And so a lot of time dealing with personnel as well as my vehicle lead. And so we really down to the bare bones and running the police, which we can manage. And so when we talk about police reform and defunding the police, and we do a very good job to manage our budget with not a lot of fat. So we took that extra fat with the overtime, some of the equipment needs. So we do the service and protection of our community. So we will continue to get out there and provide that service. A lot of partnerships, not only with law enforcement agencies, but with nonprofit as well, just to engage the community often as we can.
Chief Smith, I know this is a question you've heard before. In fact, we've been on other panels before and talked about this. And defunding the police department is not something that you want to hear about, right?
Well, I think I always go back to where it came from. And this started, out of Minnesota. And when you do a comparison, they have almost the exact same number of police officers that we have in the city of Birmingham. However, their budget is $100 million more than the Birmingham Police Department. So when you look at it from those lenses, the Birmingham Police Department has been defunded a long time ago. And so many of the things that we talked about and what we expect of law enforcement, it requires training. And so we have to have a reinvestment in our law enforcement so that we can reinvest in de-escalation training. We can reinvest in implicit bias training. We can reinvest in a number of the areas that we need to ensure that we are delivering the services that the citizens of the city expect. And so, and I know that they're saying other services, but here in Birmingham, we have a different problem. And also in Montgomery, where Chief Finley is, we still, while we want to invest in the future, we still have to deal with the crime of the day. And the crime of the day is what's driving the mission of the police department as we try to reduce crime in the community and make it safe for everyone.
In these times, are you seeing crime increase, or are you having to deal with more of it as we are dealing with more unrest and the calls for defunding police and the questions about excessive force?
So right now we're showing a decrease in our crime. However, there are certain areas where we are still showing either even or slightly above last year. We're above in our area of homicide right now, and we're also above in shots fired. And so those are critical areas that will have an influence on folks' lives and well-being. And that's why I was saying, yes, we need to invest in the future, but we have to address the crime trends, crime patterns, and doing everything that we can to keep the citizens of the cities we serve as safe as we can.
After hearing from both Chief Smith and Chief, I'm interested to hear from our activists on the panel. Ms. Williams, if you share their thoughts about whether police departments should be defunded or reformed.
Police departments need to be defunded and reformed. I'll just put it out there. When we're comparing Minnesota to Birmingham, we also have to take into consideration the cost of living. There's a cost of living change that takes place when you go from Minnesota to Alabama. So saying that their budget is a large, they're the same size department, we also have to calculate into that what is the cost of living rate. And if it's not equal, then that's part of that calculation we have to talk about. When we're talking about defunding the police, we're talking about a particular department that have absorbed over the years a lot of the services that used to be available in the community. Sheriff Pettway earlier spoke about mental health facilities and being able to take someone to a mental health facility besides taking them to jail. Well, those services have gone by. Those services are no longer available. There's countless services that used to be available in the community that have been absolved, and those dollars absorbed into our law enforcement system, which oftentimes we don't see. And no one has a conversation about that loss of services in the community. It's not that we don't want police in the community, but police and law enforcement in the penal system is a reactionary. If you get on the front end, it's kind of often have conversations and law enforcement say, why aren't we having a better relationship with the community? It's kind of like if I said to you in the time of COVID, remember the Tuskegee Institute syphilis situation with Dr. Clark. If I said to you, go down there to Dr. Clark and them, and I want you to let him work on you. And he has a situation, he's going to heal you from COVID, and he's just got to do a little testing. Most people on this call right now would say, nah, I'm good. Never mind. I don't want no parts of that, because history tells us what took place down in Tuskegee. History tells us just how inhumane the treatment those individuals received at the hands of Dr. Clark and his staff. It's the same type of memory that the community has when law enforcement comes to the community and say, we're going to give you services through the police department. Nah, cuz I'm good. Because I have a memory, I have a history of how the officer came out and beat my uncle the time he got in trouble. I might have been 9, 10 years old, but I remember. The community remembers the interactions of what happened when someone called law enforcement out for a situation and they needed assistance. It's not that we're saying that law enforcement isn't necessary. What we're saying is that there's services needed in the community in addition to the law enforcement that cannot be housed in that agency.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Let me get them to, because I saw a reaction from all three of them. I saw Chief, and Sheriff all reacting as you were speaking. Which one do you want to take it first? Chief, your mic is open, so you go first. Chief Smith. It's open. You are.
You know, I can hear you, but here's the problem. Those dollars were not absorbed into the police department. Services were cut, but there were no dollars absorbed. And I'm very well aware of the cost of living in Minnesota, and it's not $100 million more than the city of Birmingham. And the most important part is, you know, in Birmingham, we're talking about folks' lives when we start to say, let's send money here, there, and everywhere. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when bad decision making meets alcohol and drugs and a bad argument, there are no social workers there. There's no outreach there. There are none of these services there. And so the only thing that you're going to get when you dial 911 is the officer showing up. And what I'm saying is the officers who do show up, they need to have the best quality training that you can possibly give them so that they're able to make those right decisions. They're able to recognize the difference when someone's having a mental health crisis and when they're an actual threat. And they need to know the difference when they need to de-escalate and when they really need to be on their toes and paying attention to what's going on. And so that's just a different way of looking at it.
Chief Finley.
And I'm just, Chief Smith, is about that. When we talk the funding and all of that, right now, Montgomery, we just at bare minimum. But we still have to fight crime each and every day, and we still have to engage and do relentless follow-ups in these communities and try to build bridges in relationship. I understand what you're talking about the past, and so part of our training is to talk about the past deeds, and not only in the state of Alabama, talk about Jim Crow, but talk about the negative contact community and police had in Montgomery, going back to the boys, bus boycott and beyond. And so we talk about those issues. It's hurtful, it's painful, but we still have to talk about those issues, and we still have to constantly train these officers and to better serve the community. And I think that Chief is absolutely right, and the sheriff is absolutely right as far as training is essential. And we are not afraid to discipline our officers if they are off kilter policy, and we have to discipline those officers. These complaints that we got, we have to make sure that we hold our officers accountable, our supervisors accountable, and that's part of the 8 Can't Wait campaign to ensure that when we talk about the funding, when we talk about reform, that we are moving in that direction to make sure that our officer and department is accountable and is we're being responsible to the community that we serve, because every day there's something that's taking place. The last thing I want to talk about, and we talk about 21st century policing, is pillar number 6, and we talk about officer awareness. Part of that officer awareness is peer support. Part of that to make sure that we have a healthy department, and part of that as well is to make sure that we have crisis intervention training, CIT training, that every cycle that comes about, we're going to have 6 to 8 officers as part of that training, so we can have 24-hour coverage when individuals or citizens are in crisis, that we need to make sure that we have to handle that person in crisis, so we won't get heavy-handed. We know how to de-escalate.
It's something else that has been a lot of focus on, and I know I've seen some things with the Birmingham Police Department, Sheriff's Office, and I know that District Attorney Danny Carr and Lynneice, they do some things. How important, Danny, is it to have that type of community outreach like your distinguished gentleman, and how that tries to stop the crime or stop people from committing crime because you get them early before they become offenders? How important is that?
Art, I think it's very important. And let me say, D.A. Washington and I talk about that often, at least once a week, about creative ways that we can do things a little differently to make sure, because it's easy, in my opinion. When I use the word easy, I mean this in another connotation, but I've been here almost, historic, and I've been here almost 20 years. It's easy to be in the courthouse, wait on cases to come in, prosecute those individuals, get some coffee, and go home. I'm a prosecutor, job done. But the tough part, and where the rubber meets the road, is getting out there and pounding that pavement and making sure that we be responsible for holding people accountable for their actions, that you also have the courage to get out there and get in the community and try to stop people from ever getting in the system, addressing that pipeline to prison through our Helping Families initiative, addressing all the need for chronic absenteeism in school, addressing reentry by doing a second chance job fair, which people look at us and look at Lynneice, and you imagine the emails we got, You're a DA, you're a prosecutor. Why do you care? Why are you doing that? Because if you want to address crime and different things, then you have to change the trajectory of a person's life. So we understand that. So we're trying to do a lot of things to engage our young people, the black and brown communities where I'm from, to understand that the decisions you make can follow you for the rest of your life, but at the same time, you can take a different path. And if you're willing and allow me to be a part of showing you that path, then our work is not in vain. So I take that very seriously. Just like I take seriously the fact that there are some people that we're going to prosecute. That's just going to happen. But at the same time, there are some people that we can save and that we can send through our diversion course and that we can make sure that our mental health courts are done, our theft course, our drug course, all the things that we do. But we try to make sure that we take a holistic approach and make sure that each and every case will stand on its own merit, that we address them in a proper fashion. And D.A. Washington and I are real big on being in the community and making sure
All
we
right,
do
thank
our
you.
part
That
as best we
we're
can.
into our last quarter hour now. We got started a little bit late, but I want to allow each of you to have the opportunity to pick an area where we can improve and where we can bridge the gap and we can make things better between law enforcement and the community. And since Sheriff Pettway, you're nodding your head, let's start with you, sir.
Thanks, Art. That is a good question, and much work is needed in that area in which we can bridge the gap and between law enforcement and the community. And within my field of work, we believe in community policing, and that starts with the officer getting out of his vehicle, getting to know the people on his beat throughout the community. We have to have a relationship with those individuals in the community to make sure that if something happens, we can get information that is needed. We know how to police the community just by having a relationship with them. It's all about building that relationship, getting out, talking to them. I did that when I was part of a police department in Fairfield. I was a bicycle police officer. I drove a bike around the city, and I had opportunity to engage with the citizens and the little kids all the time. Many times they would invite me to come over to barbecues and whatever outings that they would have because they enjoyed seeing me. They enjoyed having us there. It was not a time that we was there to lock anybody up, but it was a good occasion. We were there on good occasions, just as well as showing up when something happened that we had to restore the peace. But during the good times, we had to be there to talk to the citizens, hear from them, to get to have a chance to build a relationship with them, show up at their churches, go to their schools, show up at different events that they're having right there in the community. We have to do that to build a relationship with them. And then that gap that is there will decrease, and we can come together and we can have a good community, and the police can not worry about the funding and not worry about all the other things that's been negatively said about them. We can have a good relationship, and then the people will support law enforcement. And that's what we want. We want to have an environment in which the people support law enforcement and bring us food. And that happens quite a bit also, where the community will bring us food, and they love to sit down and talk with us and share things with us. And I'm quite sure that both of the chiefs here are going to say the same things. And I know that they've had the same experience. And but I'll let them share it. But that's what we need to do: get out of our vehicles and engage with the community.
All right, Chef Pettway, thank you very much. Let me go over to Bishop Moody. One thing that you think that an area where we can make improvements in closing this gap and making sure that there's better communication between law enforcement and the community.
Well, ironically, Art, I think the answer is in the question. I think that there has to be more intentional communication. You know, the reality is oftentimes our attention is diverted by the unfortunate incidences. But what we don't really spend a lot of time talking about are all of the people that are working to bring change and reform. And there's a lot of people who've committed their lives to that. Many of the people that are on this call clearly are working towards that end. But these are the stories that we really don't hear enough of. And I think that there's this suspicion that can only be addressed when there is more intentional communication, when both sides on the issue of particularly justice and policing, really have an opportunity to understand what's being done. There's a lot of misinformation. There are a lot of assumptions that often are made on both sides. And I think the way that you address that is to have more intentional communication. There's a lot of hurdles that I think we've got to come together, work towards reforming and fixing in order for both sides to feel like there's substantial change. But it's relationship and its proximity that changes that suspicion and changes the narrative or even the false assumptions. So I think we've got to talk more. I think the left hand has to know what the right hand is doing. I think that there's got to be intentional conversation, even sometimes conversation that makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes we have to struggle through that to get to a place where our hearts are open to really hear, okay, this is a reality, but this is what we're trying to do. And even sometimes to be open to ideas externally, because we've got a lot of brain pool and talent that may not be within our kind of local ecosystem. But if we would involve them on what the hurdles and obstacles are, I think that we can move substantially towards the right direction. So I think we've got to do a better job about communicating across the board.
All right, Bishop Moody, thank you. And I know you've got to lead the panel. We appreciate you being with us. Thank you for those comments. Let's go up to District Attorney Lynneice Washington. One thing that we can do, one area where we can make improvements.
Well, I can speak specifically from being a prosecutor. Traditionally, prosecutors have their job has been to put people in prison. That was what defined the success and career of a district attorney, a prosecutor. But we're in a time now that tactic, that measure is not good for our society. It's not good for our community right now. Danny was speaking a moment ago about a number of programs that we involve ourselves in, trying to be more preventive, trying to be more proactive. Traditionally, DAs have been reactive. When people are arrested, they come to the court, they go through the judicial process, they're sentenced, they go to prison, and everything else that follows. But what we have been doing is trying to, especially with our young people, going to the schools and
I'm gonna hang up from you.
And educating our young people on the laws that affect them. There are a number of things that as young people they take for granted, but when they do these acts, then it turns into something criminal, and it puts them into the criminal justice system, and family court and all of that. So when you know better, you do better. We have been reimagining way prosecutors.
So go ahead and shut the door.
The way prosecutors do their job and our roles have changed. So and reimagining the role of a prosecutor in terms of changing a lot of the way that we do the way we do things, keeping in mind the collateral consequences that flow from convictions, that small marijuana blunt that young man was arrested for. What are the collateral consequences when people go to prison and when they get out? There's no preparation re-entry program for them to have a successful life, for them to re-enter the community. Those are things that we need to look at, a holistic view of making our community better. So that is my take on what we need to do going forward. You're muted.
So in the essence of time, I'll go ahead and give my part. We'll keep this train of, I'm an organizer, so we organize in the wake of everything else. I just want to say, oftentimes we are afraid to take a step back and allow people to have an opportunity to breathe. And often in this climate, I think that the community is often, especially the brown and black communities, law enforcement is shoved down our throats. You're going to do, and with no air or space to allow us to deal with the trauma of what we've experienced over the years encountering law enforcement. It's hard for me to take food from somebody who has beat me, slapped me, and done me any old kind of way, and done my community any kind of way. And you're saying, but I'm here to help you. It's hard. I'm going to have reservations. And so being open to the conversation that, hey, maybe we need to take a step back and have an intermediary here that will help us walk side by side to get to a place where they trust us, we trust you, we're working together to make the community better. Law enforcement, been there, done that. I worked in the system. I understand what it's like to be on both sides. So I'm not speaking from a person who has not experienced what it means to have to wear that badge. But at the same time, being a citizen, I also understand what it means to feel helpless at the hands of someone who has so much power to change the trajectory of my life. And just being honest to say, hey, there is some fear when people in certain communities encounter law enforcement. There is a history of how they've been treated unfairly and not always justly in a situation. Hold on. Maybe they are a little bit more intense or rowdy when we come through because of what they have experienced and what they've seen. Maybe we aren't the right person to show up at this time. We need to send someone else until that history is corrected, changed, and we've developed a new narrative norm for our relationships with Black and Brown communities.
All right. We're approaching 2 minutes now. I want to get out both chiefs, and then I got to bring in our president from the Alabama chapter. Chief Finley, go ahead.
Yes, really kind of echo what Chief Sheriff Pettway talked about. It's engagement. I'm sorry, it's engagement. We got to reach out to these communities. We got to show that we care, and by doing that, we just got to be committed. We got to show more commitment in our efforts. So we know our job is to put bad people in jail, but we want to make sure that we put the right one in jail. And I think bike patrol, foot patrol, in some of these challenged communities, we have to be there, and we have to be there not as an enforcer, but as a guardian to let them know that we're concerned, to let them know that we are there for them while we're there, and we will be that social anchor, so to speak, to develop ways to put manpower in these challenged communities through foot patrol, through community policing operations. But that is the way to go, is to say, time out, we're going to do something a little bit different. And some of our communities, Black and Brown, that need to see us in a different light. And again, that's through training, that's through identifying the right officers to put in there that have a heart and show that they care for the communities.
Thank you, sir. Chief Smith, and then we're going to wrap up with Mr. Urban.
Well, one thing that I've been pushing hard is to stay engaged. And that's the mantra that we've used for quite some time, is to stay engaged. And what I mean by that is we shouldn't just talk when we're having difficult conversations. We shouldn't just talk when something has gone wrong. We need to talk continuously. We need to stay engaged with each other so that we're discussing the things that are happening in the community. We're providing solutions to the community, and that we're working together as a department and as a community. I think we have a rare opportunity here in Jefferson County. If you just look at the panel, everyone is pushing and working together, trying to move things forward here in our area. One of the most interesting things that I had was we did a food giveaway not long ago, and I looked over my shoulder, and here's DA Danny Carr dressed in jeans saying, "How can I help?" And so that's the type of involvement, relationships, and community engagement that we
Chief
must have.
Smith, thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for being with us. We're going to wrap up with our Alabama chapter president, Mr. Henry Irby. Henry, unmute yourself and then you can give us our closing remarks.
I'm not in yet.
You are in, sir. You've been in. You're in.
Okay.
Henry, you're in. You're
You
unmuted.
can hear me, Art?
We can hear you. Go right ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Good evening. My name is Henry Irby. I am the Alabama chapter president of Noble. Many thanks to our Noble national president, Linda R. Williams, Art Franklin, of whom is a very good friend of our Alabama chapter, our fantastic audience, and our awesome panel of subject matter experts for helping to make this virtual panel and community forum a success. You know, nothing just happens. The people behind the scenes are the ones who drive our success. I would also like to thank our virtual panel committee, Wendell Majors, Johnny Johnson Jr., Irene Reed, Michael Williams, for pulling this all together. In addition, I would like to give special thanks to the many others who also worked tirelessly on this event. Tonight's conversations were invigorating, to say the least. Two things I picked up on towards the end, DA Carr and also DA Washington both hit on it, and that was having a holistic approach to solving the problem. And I also may add, it has to be comprehensive. We all are in this together, and only together can we solve these problems. As you can see, there is much work to be done and many more conversations to be had. We hope to have continued discussions on a quarterly basis, so stay tuned. Again, thank you to everyone for participating, and good night.